Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's People for Bikes virtual education series webinar focused on helping shape the future of bicycling in America. Our session today is going to be focused on complete streets mandates as a state and local level tool to help transform communities and create better places to bike. I'm Martina Haggerty, and I am a senior director at People for Bikes, overseeing infrastructure-focused policy and investments in effective local bike advocacy all throughout the country. I am joined today by three fantastic experts, Jeff Parenti, Francisco Lovera, and Jeannie Ward-Waller. They're each going to talk about their experience implementing complete streets policies in communities and organizations they have worked with. And I'm going to turn things over to these talented folks in just a moment so we can hear about their experiences. But first, I wanted to spend a few minutes giving you a little bit of background information about what we do at People for Bikes, what complete streets mandates are, and how they fit into really the bigger picture of community building and our work to get more people riding bikes more often. So we do have a few housekeeping items. Maddie, I don't know if you've had a chance to add those into the chat. The session is being recorded and will be available afterwards. And you can also use the Q&A feature to ask questions throughout, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A towards the end of our presentations. So People for Bikes is a national group. We're a national advocacy organization, and we work to make America the best place in the world to ride a bike. We're also the National Trade Association for the US bike industry. And our core belief, kind of what fuels our day-to-day work at People for Bikes, is our belief that bikes make life great. And we work to improve bicycling through three main pillars: infrastructure, policy, and participation. So earlier this year, we launched a program called the Great Bike Infrastructure Project. It focuses on helping get thousands of bike projects built for both recreation and transportation all across the country, advancing state and local legislation that helps bike infrastructure, and investing in effective local advocacy on the ground. Today, we're going to be focusing on one component of our legislative work related to the Great Bike Infrastructure Project. You can learn more, though, about the project overall on our website, which you can see the link for here on the screen. Our legislative strategies guide for bike infrastructure includes what we think are the four most effective ways to work with state and local governments to implement legislation that gets more bike infrastructure built. It focuses on state and local funding for bike infrastructure, complete streets mandates, advancing bike infrastructure through climate legislation, and creating safer streets through things like speed limits, design guidelines, and intersection improvements. And today we're going to dig in a bit to one of those pillars, complete streets mandates. If you missed our previous webinar, it's also available on our website, and that focused on state and local funding for bike infrastructure. So what are complete streets? So complete streets is a concept of road design that helps ensure that roads are designed in a way that they meet the needs of everyone using the road. That means whether you're walking, biking, rolling, using transit, or driving. And complete streets tends to include things like sidewalks, crosswalks, street trees, stormwater mitigation, bike lanes, transit lanes, great transit stops, all the things that make a street a really welcoming, great place for people traveling, no matter what mode of transportation you're using. So a complete streets mandate is an important way to implement complete streets policies. So we consider a mandate of being something that is much stronger than just a policy. So you might see in a lot of complete streets policies that the DOT or the city traffic engineer needs to consider the needs of people walking or using transit or biking. And it's usually very loosely written, a little vague, and it's not easily held to account. What's great about a complete streets mandate is if it's written in a strong way, it can really provide a legal foundation for implementation. And it can help ensure that all projects, when they're built, when roads are repaved, when new roads are built, that they're including all of the key infrastructure elements for everyone. and they can be done at the state level or the local level. There are a few things that we think make a great complete streets mandate. Having really clear project selection criteria. When are these criteria required to be implemented by the DOT? What are the exceptions to that rule, and how are they asked for? What are the design requirements? How is reporting done? And most importantly, what's the enforcement mechanism to hold the public agencies to account? Complete streets obviously have a whole host of benefits, ranging from increased road safety, to the climate, to public health, to economic benefits and local business impacts. We have a guide available on our website. In addition to our legislative guide, we've got some supplemental guides for each of the topic areas, including complete streets. You can get there through this link on our website, and each of those supplemental guides has data-backed talking points, so they can help you talk about these different impacts of complete streets when you're talking to your city council member, mayor, or community members. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our panel of amazing experts here. Our first speaker is going to be Jeff Parenti. Jeff is the Assistant Commissioner and Traffic Director for the City of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he's been for the past 14 years. Jeff was also the Deputy Chief Engineer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Recreation and Conservation for about 5 years, where he served as a steward of the state parks network. Jeff holds degrees in civil engineering and also spent time with the Brookline, Massachusetts Department of Public Works and in consulting. And he's here today to tell us about Cambridge's cycling safety ordinance. Jeff?
Thank you very much, Martina. Thank you, PeopleForBikes, for including me on this panel today. I'm excited to tell you about our cycling safety ordinance, which is a few years old now. It is a complete streets mandate, fits well within our theme today. Next slide. Before I get into the details of the ordinance, I want to put it in context a little bit and show you where the city fits in with the region. So what's a little bit unusual about the Northeast, and particularly Massachusetts, is that the cities and towns are geographically quite small. And so Cambridge is wedged in right in the middle there. I borrowed this map from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and this shows the districts within it. Boston, which has a population of about 600,000, is just to the south of the Charles River, and we're wedged in. Cambridge is 7 square miles, although one of it is water sheet, so we're really 6 square miles of land. There we are. The Boston area is host to some 65 colleges and universities, so we tend to have a very young population. Our neighbor to the north, Somerville, which is even smaller and even more densely populated, it also has a very strong bike culture. So what ends up happening is there's a very heavy demand for bike trips within and through Cambridge, and so that's led to much of the action that the city has taken. Next slide. And so I think one important question is, where did this ordinance come from? And so it was enacted by City Council. And so understanding how we have a somewhat unusual form of government in Cambridge. We don't have a strong mayor. We have a weak mayor form of government. I'm not trying to insult our great mayor, but it is a Plan E form of government where the 9 city councilors are directly elected by the voters, but the mayor is selected by the councilors and then serves that role, and she serves as chairperson to the council, but she is not the chief executive. The city manager is the chief executive, and that duty has been delegated to him, and he works under contract to the mayor, and all of the staff report to the city manager. So anything that the council does is then passed on to the city manager, who is then responsible for enacting those. We have 9 city councilors. They're all at large. We do not have ward councilors, and they have concurrent 2-year terms. So in theory, we could have a brand new city council every 2 years, although that almost never happens. Next slide. The cycling safety ordinance, which is at the bottom there, was enacted in 2019, is not the first action that council has taken. The city has had a progressive view on transportation for many years. The first one was the Vehicle Trip Reduction Ordinance in 1992, which spawned our traffic calming program and other initiatives to try to reduce the number of single occupant vehicle trips. And then later in 1998, the Parking and Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, or PTDM, was enacted, which requires commercial properties to monitor and report on their on the number of trips that they create by each mode, and they're responsible for meeting certain benchmarks in order to continue. And then, of course, the ordinance, the safety ordinance, which I'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. So here's a map of so before the cycling safety ordinance was enacted in 2019, we were already doing work within the city. I know this is hard to read at the scale, and I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation so you can take a closer look at it. But everything here that's in color, purple, red, green, these are all facilities that have either already been built or are planned and will be built soon. And so, and to orient you, Boston is to the bottom right. The Charles River runs along the southern border of the city, and Somerville I mentioned to our north. And so these facilities crisscross the city, and so we already have a very rich and deep network of facilities of different types already. Next slide. So what is the safety ordinance? It is a mandate to build separated bike lanes, such as the one on the photo here. And so one thing that the ordinance does is it says where the streets must be included. So it specifically says that the lanes must be built on these particular streets. It also sets deadlines for completion, and those were 5 to 7 years out. So we're approaching the end of that 5 to 7 year span right now. It requires 25 total miles of separated bike lanes. And who does it place that responsibility on? That's my department. Although we do get help from Public Works and from the Community Development Department, but their names were too big to fit on the slide, so I just put ours on there. But we certainly don't do it alone. We have tremendous support from other departments. And the CSO also includes the reasons why we want to reduce bike crashes, which follows our Vision Zero policy. And we also want to shift trips away from single occupancy vehicles. That's right in the ordinance. Next slide. So I mentioned 25 miles are in the ordinance, and so the ones in orange are the ones that are included in the CSO. So Massachusetts Avenue, which is the main spine of the city, that's the orange one right down the middle, and then also smaller ones like Garden Street. That one's already done, where we took it from 2 lanes to 1 lane, and we now have a 2-lane facility on the entire on the orange section of Garden Street there, Hampshire Street, Broadway. And then the purple ones, some of them are already completed. Western Avenue is one. And so we've already done a lot of the CSO work already, but this explains which facilities are part of the CSO. Next slide. Okay, so what have we accomplished to date? The CSO projects, which you saw in the previous slide, that's the mileage in each year of the CSO. And then that total so far is a little bit over 13 miles. But I also wanted to talk about the total number of facilities, which I showed you on the first map, ranging from bike paths. So I sorted these in the order of comfort. So the ones on the top of the list are the most comfortable for all users. So bike paths, grade separated bike lane, and so on. And then if you include shared lane pavement markings, which I happen not to, if you include those in there, it's a total of 105 miles of directional bike facilities. And to put that into perspective, all streets in Cambridge have a directional centerline mileage of almost 250 miles. So that's a lot of coverage. And consider that most of our locally classified streets don't have bike facilities and don't really need them. We're doing pretty well with the facilities that we already have. Next slide. And so I mentioned, so if you're interested in some of the things that I talked about, the links are at the bottom of the slide here, or you could contact me or cambridgema.gov and search for bikes. There's all kinds of material on our website. The staff have done a great job to describe and summarize the things that I've told you about today. And there's all kinds of other things that you may find interesting on our website. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Jeff. It's really great to hear about experience of the city like Cambridge has been doing this for several years and has a lot of lessons learned to share with other communities. So thank you. All right. Our next panelist is Francisco Livera. Francisco has over 19 years of transportation engineering experience, specializing in complete streets, traffic engineering, and highway safety. Francisco is a native of Mexico City and holds a bachelor's degree in civil engineering. Over the years, Francisco has worked for the Rhode Island's Department of Transportation, where he was responsible for managing the state's highway safety programs, at McMahon Associates, and at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. Since 2012, Francisco has served as the state's complete streets engineer for MassDOT, which is the Massachusetts Department of Transportation. Thanks, Francisco, for joining us.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you to PeopleForBikes for inviting us to present. Just clarification, I'm the complete streets engineer since 2022, not 2012. I'll be happy on the next slide to discuss a little bit of what we are doing in Massachusetts regarding complete streets. Next slide, Martina. We have enacted healthy transportation policy. I'll talk about the healthy transportation policy. We have an engineering directive that we issued in 2020. Some of that work predates me, defining the criteria and the justification workbook that we had developed as well, and a couple of project examples and some lessons that we have learned. As you can see in the next slide, the official story that everybody may tell you and the original plan are straight lines, but in reality, the actual experience about how all of these processes take place is more like the squiggles in the middle. Next slide. We all know that the way that we design our infrastructure is going to have a significant impact into how people live, and it's unacceptable in some locations, the way that we are doing it. On the next slide, I'm not going to read all the details, but since 2013, there was a mandate at the Secretary of the Department of Transportation in Massachusetts that every single project that involved any of the different administrations that are under the umbrella of the Secretary should have elements that are able to increase the spaces for people walking, biking, and taking transit. There was a design criteria that was defined in 2014. The department implemented and evaluated how that was working and fine-tune it as any human process that is subject to improvement. In 2020, a new engineering directive was developed. And the next slide, the intent is to be able to develop some of those projects that are similar to that. On the next slide, we're not coming out of the thin air. We have also developed a vision for what we want to have in the state, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, for walking and biking, and is demonstrated there. This is not news to everybody, to anybody on the call. Most of the trips that we do on an everyday basis are very, very short. And in the next slide, also some of those trips that take place are not necessarily by people who have the choice to select, or the privilege to have the choice to select the mode of transportation. Many times it's people that don't have that alternative. The statistics over there, we recently did a vulnerable road user assessment, and we determined that close to 50%, somewhere in that range, of the people who are injured or killed on our roadways, walking and biking, are very close to transit stops. And we're developing something on that to mitigate some of those crashes. In the next slide, the purpose of the directive was trying to incorporate some of the new guide at the time, the separated bike lane, plan and design guide that Massachusetts developed, but also incorporate elements that are in our project development and design guide that overlap with the design criteria that Federal Highway provides for many of the roadways. And in the next slide, our intent is to be able to not provide just compliant, quote unquote, traffic engineering traditional bicycle lanes that you can see on the left side. We are trying to implement infrastructure that makes sense for the kind of user that will be on those roadways. In the next slide, just a little bit of sales pitch, the different guides that we have. Separate bicycle lane plan and design guide, our roundabout guide, and our PDDG, which is currently under review. In the next slide, as part of this process, as anytime that you change something, we need to be able to communicate those changes in an effective way. So the department engaged into a series of trainings across the Commonwealth, internally with our staff, as well as with different people in our consultant community and in our municipalities. In the next slide is a very brief screenshot of the engineering directive. In the next slide, the anticipated outcomes of that directive was to increase the accessibility of safe access to transit, build that high comfort bicycle network of facilities to increase the potential for everyday bikings, increase the short trips made by walking and biking, decrease the conflict between the people using different travel modes, but also in overall, and this is something that we all know, everyone that is in the webinar, when you increase the space that is comfortable and safe for people who are walking, biking, or taking transit, inherently, you're also increasing the safety for everybody else. Next slide is a brief example of a few of the facilities that have been the result of this directive. On the next slide, what is it that the engineering directive do? It provided that controlling criteria that we do. Federal Highway has certain criteria. For Massachusetts, we incorporated a specific directive on when pedestrian facilities must be included as part of a project, when bicycle facilities must be included, as well as transit ability, whether it be ADA compliant bus stops or transit signal priority. In the next slide, we'll go very briefly. There's a lot of text there. I'm not intended to read, but it clarifies the specific criteria that is needed for pedestrian facilities. Next one, Martina, on the bicycle facilities, we tied everything to the context of the area with the context of how people are currently driving in that. Next slide. We also develop a map that gives us a guidance on where we have a potential of high potential of trips that could be taking place by walking or by walking. There are two different maps. I just included one, and then the next slide also includes another screenshot of the design justification workbook, which we're also in the process of updating. And to summarize what we're trying to do in Massachusetts, in the next slide, the intent of our projects is that we can actually have infrastructure that works for all. And some of us are very idealistic, thinking that it should be able to work for anyone as early as 3-year-old and their caregivers, comfortable, which is above safety. And then we're also in the process of getting our PDDG. In the next slide, and successful projects, we have done road diets. Martina, next one. We have implemented this first slide that we show, an area that's consistently used by a lot of people. Now it has a better space for other modes of transportation. It feels so much safer. And in this next slide, as you are trying to make bigger changes, it also has other impacts. The next slide, a few key points about what we have learned after some of the implementation. We realized that we were trying to catch as many projects as we can. So many of them were in later stages of design. We have actually been working now into incorporating most of our expectations at the early design stages, and that is helping us and giving us a lot more results. And Martina, we can skip the next slides and finalize with the intent that this is an iterative process. Next slide. Again, you may have an original idea, that may be the official story, but in reality, you have to go back and forth and convince a lot of people. I'll be happy to explain more if anybody has more questions. My contact information is in the last slide. Thank you, Martina.
Thank you, Francisco. It's really great to see not only cities embracing complete streets policies and mandates, but also state DOTs. And certainly MassDOT is an example that we hope a lot of other state DOTs might follow, whether it's implementing something legislatively or, in this case, as MassDOT's done, through the department itself, through its own directive. All right, our third and final panelist today is Jeannie Wardwaller. Jeannie joined Fearless Advocacy in 2024 as its first director of transportation advocacy, bringing experience from top leadership roles in government and nonprofit advocacy. For 6 years, Jeannie was a visible change agent inside Caltrans as the deputy director for planning and modal programs. Prior to joining Caltrans, Jeannie served as the policy director for the California Bicycle Coalition and the Safe Routes National Partnership. She began her career as a structural engineer in Boston and is a licensed professional engineer in California. Jeannie earned her bachelor's degree from Brown University and holds 2 master's degrees from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Cambridge. Thanks for joining us, Jeannie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Martina. I'm hoping that my voice holds up. I'm recovering from a cold, so bear with me. But this is super fun for me. As you said in my bio, I lived in Cambridge for 5 years early in the early 2000s. And so it's really a pleasure to be on this webinar with Jeff and Francisco and see how much Cambridge has changed. I think when I go back and visit now, the streets look very different than when I lived there. So kudos to the folks in Massachusetts, and definitely happy to be on here with you. So I'm going to talk about what we're doing in California, and I'll give a little bit of history. As Martina said in my bio, I was an advocate with Cal Bike for several years. And then I actually went inside the state DOT and worked at Caltrans for 6 years. And now I am back on the advocacy side outside of government, working for Cal Bike as a consultant and a lobbyist. So I've been kind of full circle with this issue over the last 10 years. And I'm really excited to share with you the bill that we're currently working on, which is Senate Bill 960, a state piece of legislation to really try to enshrine a mandate for complete streets in California. So go ahead, Martina, and advance the slides. So I know that I don't have to remind all of you on this call, you're very familiar with the statistics, but I just wanted to share a snapshot of the numbers in California and the really just alarming rise in pedestrian and bike fatalities and serious injuries in our state. We have a crisis. We need to deal with it. It's urgent. You know, making sure we're implementing facilities that are safe and comfortable for all users is critical. On the next slide, I'll just briefly kind of walk you through the history on this issue. So more than 15 years ago, Caltrans, our state DOT, adopted its first complete streets policy. It's been updated several times. Most recently in 2021, it was strengthened in really meaningful ways, including language about all ages and abilities, including you know, much more clear direction to different parts of the department for how to implement complete streets, because we've done a whole bunch of planning, we've done a lot of policy setting. We even have really strong design standards now for these facilities, but implementation is really lagging. And personally, for me, as well as for Cal Bike on the advocacy front, we've been engaged in this really closely. Back to 2016, we did a whole audit of Caltrans' major rehab program, which is a 4-year program of projects they adopt every 2 years. It's major pavement work, bridge work that gets done in the state, and hundreds of projects that get churned out every 4 years. So we audited that back in 2016 and found a huge number of missed opportunities to implement complete streets. We used that to start building our advocacy around Caltrans needing a stronger mandate. And in 2019, we worked on our first complete streets bill with Senator Scott Wiener, who is now, again, the sponsor of the bill this year, SB 960. And that bill passed overwhelmingly through the legislature. Unfortunately, at the time, it was vetoed by our governor, saying Caltrans was going to step up and take this issue more seriously. And now we're 5 years on. Caltrans has done active transportation plans. They've set a really ambitious target of saying they'll invest $3 billion over the next 10 years in bikeways, sidewalks, and crosswalks. But what we're seeing today in 2024 is that the planning and the target setting and all of the work is really not advancing in the way we'd like to see. So next slide, just to kind of explain what I mean about why we're not seeing implementation move fast enough. Looking at the programs between 2022 and 2024, the rate of implementation of complete streets facilities on projects by Caltrans actually went down. And by our count, looking at the 2024 plan, we see less than a quarter of projects are including bikeways, sidewalks, and crosswalk improvements, which are the things that Caltrans has set a target of saying we're going to invest $3 billion over the next 10 years. And in fact, they project investing only $280 million in the next 4 years, which is much lower than even 10% of that $3 billion target for the next 10 years. So very much not on track, even by Caltrans' own targets that they've set. So go ahead and jump. I'm going to get into what the bill would actually do. Next slide. So SB 960, first and foremost, takes Caltrans' own policy that they have adopted, that they updated in 2021, and codifies it into law. So, gives the legislature an opportunity to say, yes, Caltrans, we love the policy that you've adopted. We want to make that a stronger mandate and give it the full force of the legislature. So this language, all projects must provide comfortable, convenient, connected, complete streets facilities for people taking transit, walking, and biking. That's the kind of language that is getting enshrined in law with SB 960. It requires Caltrans to use the new standards that they've adopted. Sometimes, things get adopted at headquarters and the districts just continue to proceed and designing their projects the way they have with old guidance. So this really forces their hand to use the newest, latest, and greatest guidance and standards. And then there's also equity language in our bill. So making sure that we give special attention to underserved communities, engage them in project development teams as these projects are moving forward. We also focused on removing some of the barriers for why these facilities, why complete streets facilities are not included on projects. So often what we were seeing was that cost or added time was being used as an excuse for not including facilities on projects. And in many of your states, you're probably familiar with the pressure on DOT engineers to deliver things on time and on budget. It's a huge pressure that our DOTs have, and for good reason. We want to deliver on the taxpayer funds. However, the incremental cost or the incremental additional time that it takes to be thoughtful about not missing opportunities to add sidewalks or include meaningful bike facilities is really critical. We would argue, it's way more expensive to come back later. It's going to be way more time to come back a second time and add those facilities than doing it at the same time. So we're moving some of those excuses to not include these facilities in projects. We're also, mandating that the targets that Caltrans is setting really be true targets that they must adopt and update on a regular cadence. And they have to use their own plans and the community engagement work that Caltrans has already done in developing their active transportation plans to decide where a facility is needed and how it should be included on a project. So the next slide, I think this is, additional to what we've been talking about here, but it is an important part of the bill that we've added this year. That's an update to the version of the bill that passed the legislature in 2019. We're really also focused on, sorry if you could go back one, Martina. Also really focused on access to transit and providing transit priority facilities on the state highway system. So in addition to complete streets, including the bike and walk facilities that we traditionally think of, we also want to make sure that we're looking for opportunities for things like signal priority, queue jumps, bus only lanes, of course, are kind of like the thing that we all think of, but there are lots of transit priority treatments that can be really meaningful. And we want Caltrans to adopt a policy that also includes transit priority and then do the planning that they have done for bike and walk facilities on the state highway system and incorporate those into projects as well going forward. So I'll stop there. I think it's pretty wonky to talk about the technical details, but just to reinforce, these are the things that Caltrans has not been making progress on. So we were really trying to focus on making them take their policies and their planning seriously and follow through on the ground on projects that are actually getting built. So I include this is kind of for folks in California more than anywhere else, but we'd love support from around the country. The bill is going to its first policy committee early in April, and we're recruiting all the support we can get. My colleagues that are also working on the bill with me, their emails are here, and I think my email is on the last slide. But with that, I will stop and look forward to discussion.
Thanks, Jeannie. In California, it really is, a lot of folks look to you all as a leader in a lot of things related to road safety and funding. And so it's really great to be able to share what you're working on currently with folks. Well, we've got a few minutes for Q&A here, and I know we had a few questions roll in ahead of time, and I think I'll toss some of those out there to our panelists to see if they'd like to answer them. One question that we received was asking, what are the most significant barriers to implementing complete streets that you've encountered? And, you know, I think what I think of immediately is that it's a political issue, you know, that it's never really a funding issue. It's never these things. It's a political will issue, but I'd be curious to hear what your experience has been with barriers. Anybody want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah. Certainly, it can be in commercial areas where the business owners are afraid that will take away from their businesses. And very often it's the amount of traffic that is currently using. We are consistently in conversations and finding compromises in all the limited space that we have in New England to accommodate everybody. But certainly how to accommodate future traffic and losing business is one of the biggest concern at a local level.
Yeah, I'll jump in too. I think, I mean, it is pretty context specific. So I talked about this a little bit, that CalBike actually did a public records request and got all of the documents that Caltrans does this thing on every project now where they have a complete streets decision document. I think it's very similar to what MassDOT does with their sort of decision workbook, where each project engineer has to document, you know, why or why not did you include the complete streets facilities that are identified at a location on a project. So we've been going through those and trying to understand better what are the reasons that complete streets were not included. And I think, you know, cost and schedule, as I said already, often are things that are used. It's going to add complexity to design. It's going to add additional cost. And that's part of what we're trying to kind of remove as an excuse in our mandate, in our bill that we're working on this year. But there are there are other things that can sometimes be reasonable reasons. If you're in a rural area, sometimes, you know, you just don't have the roadway width. You know, you're constrained by features, by landscape, by, you know, sensitive habitat, of course. So those kinds of things I think are real constraints. And you know, we just need to challenge engineers to be more creative in those locations. There certainly are lots of other ways to address complete streets. So yeah, I think the political constraints are a big one though. And of course, having to make trade-off in space with parking, with roadway, you know, lanes for cars, you know, those are always super challenging political decisions to make. And I think until people actually can re-envision what the street is going to look like and how it's going to work and experience that, it's really hard to get the support up front. But once you've implemented it, you know, often people are like, oh yeah, this actually is way better and gives me more options. So you have to kind of push through some of that political fear initially.
Absolutely. So speaking of political issues, another great question that we had is about the best way to get elected officials, whether they be council members or mayors or other folks, on board with complete streets. Do any of you have experience talking with elected officials and what's worked?
I think that the best solution that we have encountered in Massachusetts is being successful in a nearby town. If a nearby town is successful on the implementation, it's going to be easier for the local officials in a different municipality to accept those changes. One thing, and Jeannie's answer reminded me a little bit of something. We are very transparent in the way that we review our design justification workbook. We actually open it to local advocates. So when we're discussing about the different limitations that we have to implement full compliance on all of the requirements that we have, we make them part of the conversation, and we consistently get feedback from them, and they keep pushing us to do more, which is good. I appreciate that part.
I mean, it's interesting with elected officials. I actually think that the, active transportation tends to be a very popular form of travel. People like having these projects in their communities. They like being able to move around. So, I think the more we do, do these sorts of projects, they tend to be very popular with elected officials. And I worked at Safe Routes to School National Partnership. Now it's just the Safe Routes Partnership, but I worked there when I first came to Sacramento, and I found that like sort of the, focusing on the trip to school or the ability for kids and families to move around their communities is really, a very bipartisan way into a conversation about active transportation, especially for the folks who tend to just like imagine like, oh, these are, people in spandex on expensive bikes that, are just like out on a Sunday ride. No, this is, about regular people and regular families and, just trying to get their kids to school. I think makes the issue feel a lot more friendly for elected officials. So I think, that's one way in to the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeannie. The other thing I might add on to that is I think finding out what that elected official cares about or what their constituents care about, and then leading with those values in your messaging when you're talking to them. So if they don't care about road safety, don't go into it talking about the benefits of road safety. Maybe it's that they care about climate change or traffic congestion or youth access and recreation. Figure those things out and then center your messaging, tailor it to that. And I think also having folks from that elected official district talk to them. So rather than saying, hi, I'm Martina, I'm from the local bicycle coalition, having someone that actually lives in a street, like, hi, I'm Martina, I live on, Smith Street, and I want to talk to you about why complete streets is important to me as one of your constituents, is going to be a way more effective way to get a foot in the door. Well, with that, I think we're just about at time. I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us. I also want to thank all of you for joining us today. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and it'll be available on our website. We'll send it out afterwards. We'll also have a blog post summarizing this with a link to the webinar coming out in the next few weeks. And hope you all have a great day.
Thank you. This is fun.
Thanks, everybody.